Hi, everyone, and welcome to our literacy series here at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, Department of Theory and Practice and Teacher Education. I am Stergios Botzakis. I am a professor in literacy education, and I'm here tonight talking to you about reading comprehension in the content areas. To start off, I'm going to talk about some definitions, just about the structure of this talk. Where's my, hold on a second. I'm going to edit this thing. Stop share. Where's my record? There it is. So we're going to talk about the structure of this talk. I'm going to start out with some definitions, and then I'm going to talk about specific reading comprehension concerns in the various content area disciplines, and then I'm going to finish up with some conclusions and some discussion points. So let's go on from there. First off, I'm going to talk a little bit about adolescent literacy because for the most part, when we're talking about content area literacy, we are talking about work done with older students. And this definition here is from Donna Alberman and Elizabeth Bermoji. And you can read it. I will not read it to you. All right. So adolescent literacy has various things bound up in it. Content area literacy being one, content area literacy instruction, and then disciplinary literacy. And when we're talking about some of these other concerns, I should also talk about reading comprehension, being that that's central to this talk. Definitely the first point, word study, fluency, and vocabulary, they're all very important, essential parts to reading comprehension. There is no reading comprehension without knowing what words mean, what parts of words are, and some kind of smooth flow of understanding and reading speed. But there's also a need to attend to different conditions and increasing demands that come along with content area reading, especially for adolescents. These usually happen in 3rd or 4th grade. That's about when they're seen traditionally, but there is content learning generally before then, but afterward, especially when you get to middle and high school, content learning becomes more housed in individual units, specific teachers. So it's important that we attend to those individual needs. In terms of content areas and disciplines, they are two separate things. The content area literacy model here is a general framework for looking at basically mining text for information. And there's a specific set of skills that go along with that in terms of determining what's important in a text, how to find main ideas, perhaps, supporting details and evidence for points. That's some kind of general framework that is generally called content area reading. But there is also disciplinary literacy. So along with these general kinds of activities that go along with reading, you also have individual needs depending on fields. So scientists read different than English learners, read different than people into English literature, read different than people that are mathematics or world language people. And so being attentive to not just general content area literacy instruction, but also the specific needs of the disciplines is key. And the disciplines, as I talk about them here, are English language arts, mathematics, science, social studies, and world language. That's the big five. I know that there's more, but these are the ones that generally get attended to in middle and high school. And they're the ones I'm going to talk about, just so you know. Something to keep in mind that goes along with content area reading is also the texts that students are reading and teachers are using to teach. And bound up in all of these texts are structures, and they're put in a way that they argue specific points. They have specific characteristics in terms of how they share information or other types of, well, whatever the text is purposed to do. So I'm not going to read them all to you, but you can look at them, and the text mirrors the kinds of thinking that goes on in the disciplines. And a big part of this talk today is just talking about how the disciplines do mirror these modes of thinking, and how these modes of thinking are the areas I think that teachers need to focus on in terms of what they do when they do teach their students. There's another 5 text structures that go along. There's some subtle differences between some sequence and process is a little bit different than time, order, chronology, in that all processes are active functions, whereas chronology is more of like a marking time kind of thing. But all of these involve a specific kind of thinking, and they all show the function of the content area and the text. And I think that students and teachers both need to attend to what these structures are, and how they afford learning and teaching to happen. So, and then there's other considerations that aren't bound up into text structure, and they're here. Things like digital literacy. Now there's, print isn't just something that lives on a page that you just read and write, by hand. There's all kinds of technological ways to deal with text, to manipulate text, to search for text, to read. Many of us read online, and I'd even argue that, interacting with things like videos and websites and things like that are modes of reading. It's just that they're not done with traditional prose. There's also things that we do think that are more traditional, like figurative language. There's things in there where that's specific types of inferences. I do talk about those too, but there's conventions and things like that go along with symbolism and things like that aren't necessarily explicitly taught, that need to be talked about. I also included graphica. Graphica is a general term for tables and charts and illustrations and anything that's visual in a sense that gives information. And visual literacy is definitely part of this as well. And some more subtle things like tone and voice, those things are not explicitly in the structure, but they are things I think that are important for readers to consider. And they're definitely, all of these things are bound up in reading comprehension. From here, I'm going to focus specifically on each content area and what it is that they may or may not attend to. And in terms of English language arts, I think some of the important things are, I put text structure, but it's because it's hard to put your finger down on, there isn't just one type of text structure that happens in English language arts classes. Literature has many forms, and there are lots of ways that affect as well as information are transmitted or communicated through the text. Figurative language becomes a bigger deal. Allusions become a bigger deal, and allusions being things that usually require some kind of background knowledge, some kind of specific experience in usually an aesthetic manner, or even other texts, and seeing how those things play out in various other texts, and they kind of communicate with each other. Also symbolism, and how symbolism functions in terms of reading texts. Giving you an excerpt here. I like to use graphic novels. I've used several graphic novels here in our talk today, as you'll see. I put an excerpt from Speak, the graphic novel, which is also a YA novel. Well, Speak is a YA novel, and this is the adaptation that recently came out. But looking at this, this is the first 2 pages of the book, and there are things that are on the page, I think, that talk about how we do comprehend text and things that we do have to pay attention to. There's a long shot at the beginning of a bus from far away. Under that, there's 2 pictures that there's nothing really explicit about it, but if you read and realize what's going on, you'll see that this is a view from inside the bus, and the first thing you see is, looks like something hitting this girl in the head, and there's all kinds of it establishes the character, establishes the relationship in the setting. And on the next page you see the front of their school, and one of the key parts is that there's the sign in front of the school, and if you can see closely, they have changed the mascot. They used to be called the Trojans, and as the text says under there, but now they are called the Blue Devils because Trojan needs condom, and they think that the school is preaching abstinence, so that they want to change the name. And in terms of symbolism, this theme of identity ties heavily into the text, and not knowing how to name something, and even the little quote there, "The devil you know is better than the Trojan you don't," in this sense. But that is, all of this is, an astute reader and a capable reader would realize, upon reading through these things, that these things are references, these things are allusions, these things are part and parcel of the general message of the book. And being a capable reader in English language arts requires you to be able to make those connections. And it's not just a matter of getting the words on the page right, but it's also getting affect and getting broader meanings, and being able also to see thematic connections across the text. And I'm not going to belabor English language arts any further. I do want to talk, though, about mathematics next. Mathematics is a content area. In terms of literacy, is usually a tough sell. I've taught content area literacy here at the university for my entire duration of my career here. And so I've taught math teachers every year I've been here. And there's a thought on the front end of coming to my class that this does not apply to them. And over the course of the semester, I don't try to disabuse them of that, but I try to show them that, yes, students do read in their classes. And reading is a very specific thing in a mathematics class, even if it's numbers and not words. They do use books, they do use, various texts. And for purposes here, I'm going to talk about algebra, calculus, and geometry. Those are the big ones that are taught in high school. And the issues, I think, in content literacy in terms of mathematics reading is, on the left, there's an equation there. I picked a visual that had lots of labeling. Mathematics is a language that is very, very distilled and requires lots of prior knowledge and experience in the field, and it's very additive and cumulative. If you don't know what a variable is, then you will be lost. You will not be able to make equations or do algebra, basically. And all of this goes back to other things like functions and operations and basic kind of arithmetic. But when you get to calculus, things become slightly more abstract when you start introducing variables, when you start introducing when you get to calculus, you call them functions. But in algebra, it's part of an equation. And there's things that are happening, and you can see that what's labeled there. You have to know what a coefficient is. You have to know what a term is. You have to know what an expression is. You have to know what the equal sign does. And everything in that has a very specific role and a very specific meaning. And it's a sentence, and each equation is like that kind of unit of meaning. It's just that it's very bound up in itself, and it requires lots of prior knowledge to realize that. When you can realize that in algebra, that's a strong breakthrough. And I think that that's something important in terms of mathematical thinking, and in terms of I didn't put the text structures in here because mathematics is so distilled, and the thinking with mathematics, it's largely involving problem solving and abstractness. When you get to something like the calculus equation, or the calculus expression that is, it's an equation, next to the algebra one, here, this is a very famous equation, And there are things that if you do not know calculus, it's very easy to get lost. There are things like limits, there are functions, there's differentiation, and there's all kinds of meaning bound up into these symbols that are shorthand for larger abstract theories and or ways of thinking about numbers and the world. And so being able to parse these things apart is, I think, a basic skill that isn't necessarily stressed with typical mathematics literacy. People need to realize that it's not just a matter of, there's an equation, there's parts of it, and things need to be broken down so that learners can realize what they are. When we get to geometry, there's a similar shorthand, but it's not so much numbers anymore. On the left here, I put a diagram of a square, and I know it's a square for two reasons. Well, at least two reasons. Number one, there's a line through each side, and that line on each side means that all those sides are exactly the same length. And so that means that, one of the preconditions for a square is that all the lines are the same length. It's equilateral. Also, inside the square, if you look at the corners, there's little squares inside the larger square, and those little squares indicate that there are right angles. So there are there are 4 right angles here, and 4 right angles means that all the angles are the same and all the sides are the same, and that most likely means it's a square. There is something missing that would definitively define this as a square. This is a rhombus, actually. I was mistaken on the front end because it doesn't have any indication that the lines are all parallel. If those were there, then this thing would be a true square, but or maybe it's both. I will let the mathematics people deal with that. But if we go to the right, on this same slide, I have a proof there. And in that proof, there is a given that ROMP is a square. And the proposition that needs to be proven is that RM, which is that line that goes from one corner to the other, is this congruent to the other line PO, which is a line that goes in the opposite direction and opposite corners. And in here is a list of the evidence in a sequential manner, and that proves the proposition. And so there's reasoning in here, there's evidence in here, there's a specific order in here, and this is a way of thinking mirrored in the writing. And this is also a big part of mathematical literacy and needs to be highlighted as such. And this is one of those, people like to poo-poo math and say, like, I never use algebra in my life. And the point is not to use algebra specifically so much as it is to practice a type of problem solving and a type of thinking that makes a certain kind of, mental activity happen. And that's the point, that people have options for solving problems and developing some kind of mental acuity. And that is what mathematical literacy is about. Aside from the rest, mathematical calculations, those are all useful in, in particular fields. But in general, for people who claim that math isn't useful, it's not the math itself, it's the elasticity of the brain function that is important. For math, I moved to science. Science is also a large group of fields inside. For here, I'm talking about the 3 that typically get taught in school: biology, chemistry, and physics. I know earth science is also one of these sometimes, but I'm choosing not to talk about that because I think earth science is some kind of combination of all 3 of these to some degree. But each one of these specific disciplines within the major discipline of science also come with different manners of thinking. In terms of biology, there are lots of collections and lists. There are descriptions. There is sequencing and descriptions of processes. Here I have an excerpt from a book called Human Body Theater, which is a graphic novel about the human body, as you might guess from the title. But I picked this passage because it's got a number of different aspects that mirror science textbooks and science learning in general. So on the top of that image, you see a cross-section of a human head, and in particular, highlighting what's going on inside the nose. And so you see, the image itself, plus there's lots of labeling. And that's one of the things that is important in biology. It's usually some kind of collection, some kind of list. There's lots of categorizing and organizing in terms of biology. All that kingdom, class, order, phylum, species, genus, species, and like there is definitely putting things in their categories is important, but also analyzing the systems that help living things function is important. Part of that is looking at the parts of the living being. So in this part, the nose and olfactory functions, right? And what is inside your body, and what, you have a nasal cavity, you have a nostril, there's a palate. How does it relate to your mouth? It's close to your brain, so that's there, but it's also connected to your ear. And so there's that. But I also included this because there's some parts at the bottom which are going to tie to chemistry somewhat. It's hard to separate all these science. I mean, we do separate them for teaching purposes, but at the same time, they are all connected at the same time. So if you're doing biology, you also need some chemistry to talk about that. And down there, they talk about water and how water works and how it's related to what's going on in terms of breathing and your nose. So that's biology. Chemistry is related, but in chemistry, there's a lot of relationships in terms of text structures with cause and effects, with inductive and deductive reasoning, sequence and processes, again, in time, order, chronology. And some of it is distilled like mathematics. At the bottom of that, on the left, there's equations there, and some of them are in symbols and some of them are in words, but this is, the process of photosynthesis. So if you look at it from the numerical values, it's 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules go through a process and become glucose, 1 glucose and 6 oxygens. And that is really shorthand for a lot of other like objects, raw materials, biological organisms that carry on this function. And those things, there's lots of shorthand in here, and there's lots of abstraction of real things. And I think that's sometimes a difficult bridge for people who are learning to do chemistry, because they want to do science, and they're used to more biological sciences perhaps, but chemistry's got a lot of mathematics to it, and so it becomes complicated. On the right here, I have an image from another book, Comic Book History of Beer, and in that, there's a lot of chemistry in making beer, and it's a similar type thing. This is a different thing done with sugar. Usually, when we look at text, it's not scaffolded in the way with images, but here it's actualized in a way, the building blocks and the little construction workers, and they're showing how enzymes break down sugars, or they break down starch into simple sugars and alcohol, and those are the byproducts represented by the little molecules, the little smoke, and the little, looks like machines. And those are the things that it's an analog for the actual process, but being able to visualize what these things are is important. And I provided a text here that does that somewhat for the reader, but typically the reader doesn't have this kind of support. You'll notice that because on our next image here, when we get to physics, this is a science that's even more abstract. And I picked an image. I was trying to find one thing that represents science, and I found this one. And it's a lot of equations, but I also picked it because at the lower right, there's concentric circles, and and in the middle, there's also another kind of, uh, you know, they're ovals around another circle. And those things are representations of atoms, which are tiny things that make up everything. And I think that's a good way of encapsulating physics. It covers a lot of different text structures, and the physics covers a lot of area. Describing the physical world um, in mathematics requires a lot of abstraction. It requires a lot of problem solving, a lot of um, just ways of thinking in imaginative ways, mathematical ways, and it's very complex. And I think there's a reason why we save that one usually for juniors and seniors in high school, because it's a difficult proposition and it's very complicated and it requires specific manners of thinking. Um, but those are the areas I think that are worth stressing, and which, it makes it the demands of physics unique. Also made calculus. I mean, calculus and physics, they were kind of created for each other. Well, physics wasn't created for calculus, but calculus was definitely created for physics. Now we're going to move into another humanity area. This content area is social studies, and the three big ones that get taught in high school are economics, government, and history. And I left out psychology, that often gets taught in high school. But for the purposes here, I thought three was a little more going with the rest. So I'm just going to talk about how these things function as content area disciplines and what they afford us in terms of texts. So economics is a field full of abstract concepts, lots of cause and effect, and there's lots of inductive and deductive reasoning that has to be done. I have an excerpt from another graphic novel here called Economics, written by Michael Goldman and drawn by Dan E. Burr. And I picked that because it does a little bit of the work of representing abstract concepts, which I think is a good scaffold in terms of disciplinary reading. But the concepts, there's history here. Adam Smith, being a person, 1776, wrote this book. And then the free market, and what does a free market mean? Because taken by themselves, those words are both, most kids in grade school, elementary school, know what free means. They know what a market is. But when you talk about a free market, you're getting into different concepts. You're talking about capitalism. You're talking about other things bound into it. One of which is represented here with this division of labor, where he describes a workshop and he shows you people, the workers and what they're doing to make pins. One draws out wire, one straightens it, one sharpens it, one puts a head on it, and they make pins. And that's one of the basic aspects of this concept, division of labor, which ends up building into more and more complex relationships, more and more complex concepts that are bound up in this field. And so that is, to me, is something that not everyone who teaches economics thinks about. And I think it's worth attending to. Also, government is frequently taught. There's also an aspect of history to government. There's also within government texts lots of cause and effect, lots of description, lots of proposition and needing to find support. There's also sequencing and definitely a lot of processes, as well as time order and chronology in the texts. And here I put an excerpt from the US Constitution, which is, something frequently taught in history, but especially in government. I put here, the first four articles in the Bill of Rights, the first four amendments to the Constitution. And so these things are, they're part of the laws, they're part of the rules of the government. And that is a very abstract thing in one sense, but it's also a very palpable thing that has direct influence on people's lives. the way these things are written is not intuitive to most students. It's not, the language is structured in a way, the grammar is structured in a way, to kind of be like legalese, and plus, it's 3 centuries old at this point, so it's also got that kind of historical language structure going that makes it slightly inaccessible for contemporary readers. And so these are things I think that it's incumbent on the teacher to keep in mind the structures, to keep in mind the intentions of the discipline when they are teaching. History is generally the thing people think of when they talk about social studies, but it's not the only aspect as I've shown so far. In history, there's lots of cause and effect, there's lots of description, there's lots of time order. The knock-on history, that's all dates and events and names of people, and then timelines. And here I've given an excerpt of Blades of Freedom, which is a recent book by Nathan Hale in his Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales series. And this one talks about the Haitian Revolution, which is the first successful slave revolution that established the free nation of Haiti that's still going today. But this book is bound up in lots of other things as well. And one of the things that impresses is just the number of entities and institutions and nations and people involved in these events. And in this chapter, it talks about Napoleon. It also talks about Francois Mackendal, and it runs them parallel. It's part of the text structure to run them in a parallel chronology. But there's lots of other things bound up in here too, about the American Revolution, about the French Revolution, about the presidents in America at the time, as James Monroe, and how those things, or actually it was Thomas Jefferson. James Monroe is the ambassador that helps this thing happen. He ends up being president later. But all these things are bound up together, and it's definitely a specific way of thinking and a specific way of reasoning and trying to make sense of these things that is important and needs to be taught explicitly. Also part of history are they love to do original documents in history, and they love to do political cartoons. And I included this one here. Part of being a historian is being able to decipher images like this. This is actually by Benjamin Franklin, and it's a political cartoon for the original U.S. colonies. And I mean, the message, join or die. And it's this weirdly segmented snake, and all these states, that are represented in these various segments. The Carolinas and New England, Vermont, they're all separate. Maryland, Pennsylvania, they should all join together and or die. That's basically the message here. But there's so much context that isn't apparent, and you have to be able to know what the abbreviations stand for. And there's a lot of context that needs to be pretty evident in the learner and presented by the teacher to make this thing make sense. And finally, I'm going to talk about world languages. Those are generally French, German, Latin, and Spanish, and at least in the schools around here. And to my experience, those are the big 4 languages taught. And I'm not going to approach them all individually, but what I am going to say is that when it comes to world language, there's a huge range of things that need to be attended to. On the onset, it's very much like emergent literacy instruction, in that you have to get like the basic words in first. So I try to represent that here with this Spanish language version of Green Eggs and Ham. But you have to learn the functional words. You have to learn, the to be's and the thes and a and he and she and all like the basic words. So in that sense, it's a lot like elementary grammar and vocabulary instruction. Again, it's like recapitulated. But then you have a range of concerns that you have to attend to, because the contexts are different, the vocabulary gets more complex, and you start applying them to social situations. And when you start applying them to social situations, you also get into sociocultural concerns, and in the various languages, language is very difficult to separate from culture. And so, you will end up speaking about Spanish cultural items if you learn Spanish. You learn about German. I mean, you can't learn Latin without knowing or learning about Roman history, especially because after a while, all the texts end up being just Roman history texts. So those things are important as well. So it's not just a matter of learning the text structures and the elementary kind of grammar and vocabulary. You also have to learn about the societies that these languages are used in. Now that I've talked about all the content areas and what goes along in each specific discipline, I just wanted to make some points I think are worth talking about in terms of what reading comprehension means in terms of the content areas. Number one, adolescent literacy needs are complex and multifaceted. So all of these areas need to be addressed in some sense. They're all taught. Students have to go to all these classes, pass all these classes, and demonstrate, facility or an ability in reading comprehension in these areas. And they're very different in terms of fields, in terms of thinking, and in terms of the outcomes that you want. And one thing I wanted to stress is that I'm talking about reading, and that does not really take into account actual disciplinary practice. It is very possible to be a good science student in terms of reading and memorizing science, but that does not necessarily translate into laboratory practice or into any kind of scientific hands-on field. That's part of the reason why a class like science has a lab component as well as a learning component, or because there is an application that doesn't necessarily translate from an aptitude in, personally speaking, I can memorize science. Like as a student, I was very adept at science reading. I wasn't always the best at doing labs. And so those things are definitely separate concerns. Disciplinary practice also requires a lot of adaptability and flexibility, especially if you think about what's happening in terms of a school day. Typical school day, students go to all these classes. And so, they have to shift gears 5 times at least. And, they're a mathematician for an hour. Then they have some, a little break to, run across the building. Then they're a literary analyst, a literary critic for an hour. And then they go, and, after a short break, maybe they have lunch, they turn into a scientist for an hour and a half if there's a lab. And then, they have to go be a language person. And those things all require different modes of thinking, and as well as, mental just energy in general. So I think one of the things that's worth mentioning too is that it's pretty amazing that adolescents can and do function in this environment, being how much we ask of them to do. And then finally, there's so many other parts that need to be attended to, including students' individual needs, standards, the demands of the disciplinary knowledge, the disciplines themselves. They all have various, markers of excellence, various modes of thinking, and various outcomes that they, look at as positive. So those things are all also worth. They require, there's a lot of plates up in the air, like spinning around. Is what I mean there. That brings me to the end of my talk. So I'm going to say thank you. And also I have a feedback form about this talk. I'm also going to open it up to questions. If anyone here would like to ask a question, I can do my best to answer, but I'm going to put the link to the feedback form into the chat for you. If you'd like to complete that, that'd be great. Thanks. I'm going to stop sharing too.
Thank you, Dr. Botzakis. That was wonderful. You can also stop the recording if you wish, so that we can open it up for
Okay.
questions. And we have Sen Wang.